Today's session, our main attraction is Jeffrey Sachs, who is a world-famous economist, but also much more than that. He is a broad thinker with an acute sense of history, a penchant for normative reflection, and an extensive political experience. He has a detailed comprehension of the crises our world is facing, such as the COVID-19 crisis, a fragile financial system, a looming climate catastrophe, and a shifting power balance among superpowers. But he also grasps the larger picture, the possibilities for a world in which such dangerous crises would either not arise or else be contained through effective global institutional arrangements coordinating concerted action. A world in which the danger of war has become remote, in which severe poverty has become a distant memory, in which the benefits of innovation are accessible to all. Humanity has all the wealth and technology such a world requires. We know enough about the functioning of social institutions to conceive workable models, drawing on successful states and unions of states such as the EU. And yet, like Tantalos, we seem unable to reach what is so plainly within reach, to recognize ourselves for peace, justice, reorganize ourselves for peace, justice, democratic governance, and the common good of humankind. If this continues, it's just a matter of time that our luck will run out and we'll be destroyed by war, disease, or economic or ecological collapse. Or is this too pessimistic? Are we on the right path, perhaps already, with the SDGs, for example, making enduring and accumulating progress toward a morally based world order? What can humanity achieve in this century, and how can we achieve it? On these big questions, we now hear from Jeff Sachs, and as he said, we want a good discussion, so get yourselves prepared to discuss what he will give us as first input.
Great.
Jeff, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for those wonderful words of introduction to guide our discussion today. It is indeed a very complicated and interesting time that we are living in, to say the least. And I'll pick up on Thomas's wise words with a couple of examples. We have this newly emerged virus, SARS-CoV-2. We can talk more about why these zoonotic diseases are occurring, but for the moment, let me just focus on one pertinent fact, and that is well under 1 year from the identification of this virus, we had several effective vaccines already developed. This is in record time. Typically, vaccines have taken 10 or 15 years to develop. Several vaccines were developed in less than a year and are now in deployment. That tells us something. It tells us we are in an age of highly successful science. We are in an age of dramatic innovation, and that's an extremely positive note because we have the possibility to do things that we did not have even just a few years ago. Let me take a second point, however. We had Donald Trump as president until recently. He is psychopathic, extraordinarily dangerous, and almost won re-election. This country is deeply divided. It had a white supremacist psychopathic leader who had a serious following in the United States and still has a serious following. We have a significant proportion of Republican Party members saying that they would follow Trump into a third party. That is a deep social illness. We could not solve problems in this country with such a person in charge, but clearly his gaining power was not entirely accidental or incidental, because the following is indeed so strong. So at the same time that we can develop vaccines with unprecedented speed and remarkable efficacy and new technology platforms like the mRNA vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna, at the same time, we did not have functional political institutions to keep a psychopath out of power, or after an insurrection in which he tried to overthrow the government, even to have that widely understood and acknowledged. And indeed, in our Congress, to this moment, not acknowledged by almost half of the members of Congress. So this is a startling contrast with the scientific efficacy. Maybe one good way to think about it is a favorite expression of mine of Professor Edward Wilson at Harvard, who I regard as one of the great people of our world and one of the great scientists, the evolutionary biologist, who likes to say, we have entered the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technologies. And what Professor Wilson is indicating in that quip is that our human motivations, emotions, thought processes are evolved and the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And we have a human nature, which I do believe we have. And it's a human nature which is slow changing, the product of human evolution. We're fairly mixed up in how we think, sometimes sublimely rational, sometimes perversely nutty, but that is our human nature. Then we have institutions such as the US government, the federal government, which was created in 1787 in a constitutional convention, which in some ways had great genius to it, and in some ways incredible cruelty. It was a constitution of slavery, for example. It was a constitution that also reflected realities of 230 years ago. For example, representative government, because the idea of active participation of the public was impossible when it took weeks to get to Washington rather than seconds to get online. So we have a set of institutions that were developed more than 2 centuries ago and clearly do not function very well. They have produced contested elections now several times in a row. They have given the presidency twice to the candidate who had lesser votes because of the Electoral College and its oddities. And aside from the institutional aspect, the racial legacy of the founding of this country remains today in a culture war between white supremacists and the rest of society. So this is the medieval institutions. And then we have science. And science is a remarkably successful social enterprise since the 16th century. It builds on itself. It has created mechanisms of knowledge creation that are strong, robust, and with increasing returns to knowledge. So the more knowledge opens up more frontiers for further innovation. And this remarkable success leads to what Wilson called the godlike technologies. We don't understand them. We don't, I don't know how my phone works. I don't know how this Zoom works. I don't know how almost anything works that I depend on daily. I could probably say a few sentences about it, but in terms of real deep understanding, we're in the hands of engineers and systems experts who may or may not be governed. I don't know about you, but I don't really have a clue as to what's going on inside Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and so forth anymore. I read about it constantly, but who knows? And I certainly don't know how they interact with the National Security Agency, the Pentagon, and other parts of the systems technology that we are enmeshed in. So this all means that the world is extremely complicated and not especially well governed in any way. With all this knowledge, this foolish country that we're in ended up tragically with more than 500,000 deaths from COVID. And you can compare that with under 5,000 deaths, less than 100th in China, for example, which was able to contain the pandemic and stop the deaths, basically, while the United States could not. So it's very sobering. We're in the business every day of attacking China, but the starting point, I would say right now, is that China contained the pandemic and we did not. And it's notable, that fact, and it's a terrible blight on human rights in the United States that 500,000 people died because of the disastrous low quality of governance in our country. Well, we're trying to do something about this. So the basic idea, and it's an idea really that goes back to around 1620 of Francis Bacon, is that we ought to be able to turn science and technology into human well-being. So that's an interesting idea. I think Bacon, when he had that idea, made a real breakthrough for humanity by saying in the New Atlantis that we ought to be able to harness systematic knowledge and experimentation to improve the human good. And I think that most of the gains that we have had in life expectancy or in escape from poverty and in quality of life is due mostly to advances in know-how to be able to do things better. And of course, to the extent that that know-how can be harnessed. Harnessing that know-how is a very complicated challenge, however. The first point is that almost all science has adverse sides as well as positive sides. So we keep on finding that we're stuck between need and difficulty in scientific advances. Even the beauty of the most important invention of the industrial age, the steam engine and what followed, the internal combustion engine and the gas turbine, it turned out that as much as those inventions dramatically slashed poverty around the world, they also had the side effect of producing carbon dioxide that is now presently wrecking the planet. So it's a good example that technology tends to be potentially very positive, but also very difficult to govern. Or closer to our own time, the secrets of the atom, of course, produced nuclear energy and nuclear weapons that almost ended the world. And we're still unable to govern nuclear weapons properly. And so the greatest advances of physics knowledge of the last century since Newton, the breakthroughs of general relativity and quantum physics, also produced the most harrowing close call for humanity in the nuclear arms race. And we still have thousands of nuclear weapons that could destroy the world many times over, and completely stupid people like Donald Trump that come to power and that therefore put us into grave risk. Now we have the digital revolution, and it is extraordinarily powerful. It is reshaping the world. It is, in essence, why vaccines could be developed in less than a year. Though that is a bioengineering phenomenon, it is also a digital phenomenon, because we could sequence the viral genome quickly and then translate that sequence into an mRNA strand and put it in a little ball of fat, and lo and behold, Pfizer and Moderna were able to come up with effective vaccines in a short period of time. So digital knowledge brought us there, but digital knowledge is also creating infodemics, fake news, a divided world, an epidemic of depression, and new cyber weapons, cyber warfare, autonomous weapons. My God, everything has this other side to it. And maybe it's because we keep coming back to the fact that with all this technology, we are still with our Stone Age emotions and unable to govern ourselves properly for our own safety. We face several big challenges, therefore, and let me just summarize those and turn them and say a few words about what I am trying to do, and then turn it into a discussion. So here we have arrived in 2021 with, I would say, two overarching facts of the world. Maybe, actually, let me make it three overarching facts of the world. First, we have a host of environmental catastrophes underway that are themselves a reflection of the fact that the economic productivity and level scale of activity worldwide has increased hundreds of times since the start of the Industrial Revolution. We have 8 billion people on the planet, where we had 800 million at the start of the Industrial Revolution. We have output around the world that has increased tremendously, largely through the application of fossil fuel energy. And that scale of activity has created 4 major environmental catastrophes. One is climate change. The second is loss of biodiversity and destruction of habitat. The third is mega pollution. And the fourth is the increasing frequency of emerging infectious diseases that jump from animal populations, in this case, horseshoe bats, probably in Southwest China, to human populations. So these environmental crises are global in scale. They're deeply entrenched. They reflect the basic functioning of the world economic system, and they can kill us. So we have to do something about them, and we have to decide to do something about them. So that's one mega bucket of challenges. A second mega bucket of challenges is the profound inequality in the world. Broadly speaking, we went from a world in which everyone is poor to a world in which a few are super rich beyond imagining. A lot of people are quite rich by any standard. Most of the world is out of abject poverty in the sense that their daily meal, safe water supply, physical safety, subject to pandemics, is secured. And part of the world, maybe 15 to 20%, is in abject deprivation. So the world is hugely unequal. Very interesting question of how it got to this level of inequality. I've spent about 40 years thinking about that question. Maybe we can discuss a little bit of it, but suffice it to say that at the start of the Industrial Revolution, there was general poverty. Now there is an incredible spectrum from Jeffrey Bezos at one end with $200 billion of wealth to hundreds of millions of people that basically do not have assurance that they're going to have enough to eat tomorrow. And that's a world that is sad, immoral, unstable, dangerous, because to have so much suffering in the midst of so much wealth is actually quite different from having so much suffering, because now we could solve this problem, but we choose not to. Now poverty is a matter of choice. It's not a matter of fate. It is absolutely, mechanically, it could be ended by simply redistribution of income. That would not be very heroic, actually, because there's so much wealth at the top. If the rich countries gave a few percent of their income to the poor countries, there'd be no abject poverty anywhere in the world. There are other ways to end poverty as well, but the point is poverty is now choice. Inequality is political choice or political system outcome, let's say, not the inevitability of subsistence with poor technology. And the third major factor that I would put on the table is geopolitical stress. Basically, we have had a world dominated by Europe and then the United States for about 300 years, depending on how you date things, but maybe from 1700 onward. Of course, the age of European empire began around 1500 with the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, but the real predominance of Europe, especially in Asia, started only later and really occurred only with industrialization in the second half of the 18th century onward. Industrialization came first to England. England then went and kicked the shit out of everyone in its way, took over India, colonized much of Africa. That's what that vast advantage of industrial and military power meant. It brought about an empire that was unique in history in its global power and reach, and was the result of, it was the first empire of industrial power. It then was supplanted by the US empire since the Second World War, essentially. And now the US, and so that is the backdrop. But I would say that that world of North Atlantic domination is ending just now in these days, maybe this hour, because of the rise of China, of East Asia, the fact that Asia has become a very dynamic location for science and technology. So the core driver of economic power, which has been science and technology, is no longer limited to the North Atlantic region. This, in its imminent moment, is leading to anxiety and stress between the two most powerful countries, the United States and China. The fact that China is the second power in the world right now is unbelievable, considering where China was 40 years ago, except for the fact that China mastered the new technologies and did a very good job of catching up through very high rates of saving, building infrastructure, and excellent education. And this enabled China to make an extent of progress for 1.4 billion people that only had its rivals in the smaller countries of East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. So this remarkable development of China has changed geopolitics. And more generally, I would say we're feeling the fact that the US and Europe just don't run the world the same way that they did for centuries. The only problem, in my view, is the US doesn't know it yet. So the US still thinks that it runs the world. And President Biden, in his speech to the Munich Security Conference just a few days ago, basically said, we're back. We're back as world leader. But it strikes me as a kind of anachronism. We are back, we are limping, we can barely make our own institutions work. We can't stop a pandemic, we can't stop an insurrection. And yet we're back to lead the world? I don't think so. But that is the image of the US, the self-image built up after decades and decades of technological leadership. So why this is important in my mind is that it poses the threat of conflict in the midst of everything else. If it were just competition and who's going to win and who's going to lose, it wouldn't be so interesting historically, in my view. What makes it, for me, very unnerving and dangerous is I do not want to see the US and China spiral into hostility. And while it seems far-fetched right now, it's not impossible. And it would just be crazy. But it's crazier things happen. And that's what I worry about in this third domain. I don't want to divide the world. I don't want a new Cold War. I don't want a club of democracies that confronts the club of autocracies, as if these words mean what they're purported to mean, because they're vast oversimplifications. Maybe if we put the world of white supremacists on one side and others on another side, we'd have a different division of the world. So I would prefer not to have the world divided, but to actually have the world working together to try to bring these two structural crises, the crisis of environment and the crisis of inequality, under control. That, to my mind, is our challenge. So let me just end by saying that that challenge I call, or that, I mean, I don't call it, but I use the term sustainable development as the definition of intentionally trying to steer global society towards inclusion and environmental sustainability, which I regard as the two great structural challenges of the material world. And the sustainable development goals are short-term goals over the period to 2030 that the member states of the United Nations have adopted to help guide this process. The Paris Climate Agreement is the agreement that has a intended time horizon, at least to mid-century or perhaps to the end of the 21st century, to help guide the transformation of energy systems and industry to sustainability. And what I'm trying to do in my own work is to think of ways to accomplish the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. So to try to understand how to change our medieval institutions, how to educate our Stone Age emotions, or to tame them, how to harness technology so that we could actually make the transformation. When you think about it in those terms, it turns out technology is the least of the problems. We've got terrific solar power, we have terrific wind power, we have great Tesla electric vehicles, we have a lot of solutions. The solutions are not the challenge. The challenge is mobilizing resources, tax revenues, global cooperation, private business, and so forth in the path of solutions. And that requires a mix of politics and economics, but it is in essence, in my view, like a design project, how to make the road shift in a different direction so that we don't go over the cliff, but go around the mountainside in a safe manner. And I will stop there, turn it back over to you, Thomas, and we can have a discussion about that.
Very good. Thank you, Jeff. And maybe let me start with this question. What are the most important reforms of global governance that you think we should try to achieve in the rest of this century? So do you foresee that we stay more or less with the institutions that we have and we just behave better? We have better leaders, we don't re-elect Trump, and hope that the leaders will see the light and will kind of do the things that need to be done, mobilize the resources that need to be mobilized? Or is it crucial also to change the institutions that are governing the planet? So things like the United Nations, for example, do we need new institutions? World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, and so on, do they need to be replaced? Do they need to be modified in order to create a different system of opportunities and incentives for states that would then make it more likely that they behave well?
I would start with the one core idea of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a theological doctrine and a political idea that problems need to be solved at different levels. Some problems are our own problems, thank you. So solve your own problem. Don't bother anybody else. Some problems are problems of our street level. Put a stop sign up, or stop speeding, put a speed bump. Some problems are problems at the scale of the city. Some problems are scaled at the state. Some problems are scaled to the national government. Many problems are regional. For example, if the United States is going to have a workable zero carbon energy system, it should cooperate with Canada and Mexico to do that. Similarly, in Europe, 27 individual energy systems don't make sense for the European Union. One needs a European-wide system. So those are regional, and some problems are global. For example, setting limits on greenhouse emissions is a global challenge. Eliminating nuclear weapons is a global challenge, and so forth. So subsidiarity says basically recognize that different problems come at different levels, choose the level closest to the human being at which a problem can be solved. No need to have the United Nations decide on the speed bumps on your street. That's something you should do in your own neighborhood. But when it comes to nuclear proliferation, this is probably not something that can be accomplished in the Upper West Side of New York, for example, or in New Haven. It's something that is a worldwide challenge. So subsidiarity forces you to think more clearly about what should be assigned to what. In the United States, we have complete confusion on this issue for a lot of reasons, but part of our country says nothing should go to the UN. We need America first. As if we don't have global problems. Trump was an idiot. I'm using technical terms, but just to understand that this is such bad governance that we end up not solving any of the global scale problems. And Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, pulled us out of the World Health Organization, pulled us out of UNESCO, pulled us out of the Human Rights Council, pulled us out of the Iran nuclear treaty, and so forth, all of which require global scale governance, not anything that can be solved at the national level or below. So it doesn't matter whether America's first or not. What matters is whether you can solve the problems that America's facing, America alone, and you certainly can't do that. So that's the first point to say. Now, in terms of reform, governments don't work at any of those levels very well. So the answer is we are in constant need of innovation because our institutions are inherently lacking our technologies. So we're inherently using old style ways to do things that they're not equipped to do. I believe in general principle, though I don't know how to do it, and I would expect the people in this class to do it, the students, not the professors. I think you can reinvent government to be online to a large extent. That way we could have participation by everybody, not just 535 representatives in the US that don't really represent anybody anymore, but we could actually participate. I would like wiki legislation. I'd like good webinars on our national issues. I would like us to be able to vote online on substantive issues. I know there are many problems with that, but I think the problems are less than the problems of not having participation. So I would like to see what could be done in terms of innovating how government functions. At the national level, we have a big problem, which is that most problems that we face today require regional cooperation. So the United States, Canada, and Mexico at a minimum need to work together. We don't need a wall. We need solar energy and transmission grids from Sonora, Mexico. So that's quite different. And we need regional cooperation almost everywhere. But as a legacy of geopolitics and as a legacy of imperial strategies of divide and conquer, most regions of the world are divided, not well unified. So in East Asia, supposedly China's on one side and Japan and Korea are on the other side, though the three countries ought to be working together to solve the problems of Northeast Asia. And similarly in South Asia, India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons pointed at each other rather than bus lines connecting the two countries. They don't trade with each other. They don't exchange ideas. All they do is share rivers, though. They share the Punjab. They share renewable energy, but they don't even talk to each other. It's absolutely unbelievable and extraordinarily dangerous this way. Or in the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia each represent different major ethnicities. Turks, Persian Shias, and Arab Sunnis, and yet they are all part of a drying ecosystem and a hydrocarbon dependence that is hugely problematic. They need water resource management. They share the same dust storms. And for God's sake, they should be solving the problems together rather than trying to buy more F-15s to kill each other, with America trying to cash in on its arms trade. So this these regional conflicts are doubly deadly. They're dangerous in and of themselves, and they prevent the kind of cooperation that is needed. But the United States likes to foster them. We're on the India side, not the China side. Or Korea and Japan are on our side. We're against China. We had the incredible temerity and foolishness to try to negotiate a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement with Japan, China, Australia, and so forth, with the whole idea that China wouldn't be part of it. But if you look at a map, China is actually in Asia. And so to have an Asia trade agreement without China is a little bit stupid. And that's American mentality. Why create hostility? Because we want to be dominant, not because we want to solve problems. So this is part of the governance issue. So to come to your question, Thomas, we need reform at every level. At the UN level, there are many reforms, but one is that the Security Council is an institution that is extremely important, but it's been frozen in place since 1945 in structure, essentially, not quite, but almost, because the so-called five victors or United Nations of the war against fascism, the US, China, Soviet Union, France, and United Kingdom, are the five permanent members of the Security Council, but this is an out-of-date allocation of seats. It doesn't, even for me, make too much sense to do this kind of representation by countries rather than by regions, because there would be a way to have East Asia represented, South Asia, and then you make the countries in the region talk to each other and agree on shared strategies and so forth. But the Security Council really needs reform. India, which has 1.4 billion people, is not represented in the Security Council with a permanent seat. And that's an amazing anachronism, actually, for a country that is almost 20% of the world's population. And in the midst of a lot of the issues of security. More generally, the UN is vital for this global scale problem solving, but it is rickety, not very efficient, underfinanced. So there are many, many problems with how the UN operates. I don't want to create something different because it would just be the UN again. I want to reform the UN. One of the things I would like to do is give the UN agencies a lot more money so that they could solve problems better. You know, the entire core budget of the UN, unbelievably, is $3 billion a year. The core budget of New York City is almost $100 billion a year. So the UN runs on a tiny level of financing because the big powers don't want to share sovereignty with the UN institutions. And yet the big powers therefore can't solve their own problems because big power politics is not the same thing as solving global problems. So we need reform at every level, but I basically believe in the UN system as a system of universal admission, as a charter that says that problems should be solved peacefully rather than by war, and as an institution that has a international law based on human rights, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is extremely important, about to have its 75th anniversary, and also needs an upgrade and needs people even aware of it, because human rights can't thrive unless there's an awareness of human rights and unless the rights and what are the responsibilities alongside those rights are updated for the 21st century. So lots of good reforms to do, lots of good papers to write, lots of good thinking to be done, but I would not abandon multilateralism or start from scratch because we have these institutions. They're pretty good, but they are disempowered by the major countries and they need actually strengthening, not weakening.
Thanks, Jeff. Any questions from the audience? You can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself. Then I see that you want to, or you can wave if you want. Radian.
In your introduction, you suggested that redistributing wealth to developing countries is one solution to poverty. In what way do you envision that happening where these countries are where politicians in developing countries are notoriously known for embezzling humanitarian aid money. And if you were to suggest that there must be like an independent board or something of the like, do you think that would violate the principles of subsidiarity and autonomy, where locals don't get to decide how to allocate the aid?
Well, first, I would say the rich countries are more corrupt dollar for dollar than the poor countries. So I'm not at all persuaded that there's some ranking other than the rich countries having a history of violence, abuse, conquest, and corruption to suppress the poor countries. The United States has a lot of answering to do. The British have a lot of answering to do for what they have created and how these systems continue till now. Trump was thoroughly corrupt. We will now get his tax returns shortly, and that will be fun. And we'll see how things work here. This latest campaign, by the way, or this latest election cycle, I think, I don't remember the price tag, $12 billion or something was the expenditure. 12 billion bucks for this election cycle. That's a lot of money changing hands. And don't believe that that's a lot of innocent money changing hands. This is buying a lot of political power and a lot of structural policies. So governance is not great in a lot of places. Having said that, I would also agree with your solution, which is that in general, finance should be seriously directed and supervised to purposes for which it's put, whether it's in the United States or whether it is in any part of the world. I don't see any difference of that. I helped to design 20 years ago something called the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. At the time, the reason that motivated me was, and Thomas has been working on these issues with the great energy and importance for this period. And poor people don't have access to the drugs that save their lives. It's unbelievable. And 20 years ago, there were antiretroviral medicines that poor people could not access. And so Africans were dying for the stupid reason that, of course, they're poor. That's not a reason to die. That is a reason to help. And so I propose that we fund that. And that proposal was taken up and turned into the Global Fund. In the process of designing the Global Fund, my critics, and there are many of them, believe me, said, this won't work. These people are so corrupt. There's no way you can take money and actually transfer it into medicines and then into delivery and then into care and treatment. And the claim was you could not make something like a global fund work. Turned out not an issue, by the way. Yeah, corruption here and there, like there is in any human organization. But the Global Fund has saved millions of lives from each of the three diseases. And the public health infrastructures are able to procure medicines, get them into the hands of community health workers, get them into the mouths of people that need them, and save lives. And it's not as if that organization has been plagued every year with new charges of corruption. There have been scandals now and then, but in an organization that works in 100 countries, you hardly hear of such problems because it's a systems process. And by the way, it's roughly the same reason why even in an extremely poor country, generally speaking, you can fly in and out on a civil airline without really too much risk, a little bit higher than in a rich country, but really very, very low risk because the systems work. They're engineers, they take care of the planes. The airlines insure the planes, the insurance companies, and the IATA and the companies and so forth have reason to try to prevent the planes from going down. And if there has been any corruption in civil aviation in the last few years, it's been Boeing, not what's happening in these other countries. Boeing really screwed up in a major way on its 737 MAX. And now another plane has lost an engine, so it's grounded another part of the fleet. I don't know what's going on Boeing. The planes are still relatively safe, but my point, Radian, is that in poor countries, things work. One of the reasons, by the way, in poor countries, corrupt presidents are smart enough not to put their brothers or children into the charge of air traffic control because they don't want to die when they fly also. So they leave it alone. And when we make systems like that, fiber systems, connectivity systems, energy systems, healthcare systems, you professionalize it. So it's not just money into the hands of a politician, it is money directed at a quantifiable and monitorable problem. And these days, since you can monitor everything in real time, because everything is online, you can literally watch the barcodes, you can watch the supply chains, you can watch the functioning of the infrastructure in ways that were not possible before. So I am trying to think about ways to transfer a couple $100 billion extra into African development right now in very specific ways in the fiber grid, fiber network, in the energy accessibility and so on, in online education and telemedicine and so forth. The technical problems and even the management problems are not the big problems. The big problems are getting the money to do it and convincing the donors, so-called, or the financiers or the market mechanism to provide the financing.
Okay, any other comments, questions?
Martin.
Yeah, what would you have to say about Cuba and what they've been doing in the world?
Cuba is complicated story. First of all, if Cuba were not under an unending US attack, the situation could be vastly different from what it is. So the US has had an embargo on Cuba now for 62 years. It's enough. It's ridiculous. And the whole Cuba story, is a nightmare that did not have to go the way that it went. Castro came to New York City in 1959 and made a good run for trying to get some decent relations, but Eisenhower and then Kennedy decided that he had to be eliminated. And this was a dreadful US policy mistake, more than that, but we couldn't face up to the reality of the essential colonial relationship under Batista and all that that meant. And the US was in the business of overthrowing any leftist government in South America or Latin America for quite a long time. So the Cuban situation has been poisoned by US-Cuban animosity for more than 60 years. The thaw that came with Obama was, of course, completely reversed by Trump, all in the interest, in my view, of just making sure that he won the state of Florida. So much of our Cuba policy is really about Florida's electoral votes, not about the substance of Cuba. But in terms of what Cuba is doing,
yeah,
it's a mixed story, because from the early days, Cuba did a good job of social services. Its first campaign was a literacy campaign. Cuba made the best public health system by far in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America. The economic side was not very good, and Cuba is crumbling, partly because there isn't a kind of normal path for the economy, partly because of the US embargo, partly because getting out of the mess that they're in is hard. But the economy is very poor, and the social services are very good. That is I think, the continuing problem right now. But the overarching problem is that we need normal relations with Cuba. Let Cuba figure out its next steps without getting recolonized by Florida expats and their children, and reopen the economy to a proper mixed economy. But the economic system definitely does not function, from what I can see and from what I know.
So the industry, in terms of technology and vaccines and health, international health brigades, do you think that's of any significance?
Yeah, that's good. This is the one sector where there's real competence and real contribution, but it's not enough to make the economy function on a broad level. Cuba needs tourism, for one thing, which would be quite easy to do if we had normal relations. But the health sector and the biotechnology, especially if it were more connected with the rest of the global biotechnology community, could be a real strong point.
One final question.
Yeah.
Do you think the profit motive is a problem when it comes to, these global problems that you're talking about, including healthcare?
Yes and no. I believe, broadly speaking, that Northern Europe has gotten a pretty good balance between the profit motive and social responsibility and accountability. Not perfect, but I'm basically a social democrat myself, meaning that I don't think the Swedes are rapacious moneymakers the way the Americans are. So I think that one can have a profit motive and still tamp it down, have social norms of responsibility and accountability, have a working corporate part of the economy, but corporations that are by law and by social norm responsible, and governed also by boards that include worker representation, like German co-determination, or mandates of gender balance, as in Scandinavia. And I think that works quite well, actually. Not perfectly, but where things get rapacious is the more Anglo-Saxon version of this, which is not a social democratic ethos. And in the United States, we have the weird mix of, well, it's not an accident. It is British liberalism in its historic roots, combined with racism and the potent result of that is a kind of radical libertarianism of part of our political system that I think is in service of white supremacy and in service of the plutocracy. So it's a nice combination, a not nice combination, I mean. So I think that the United States is really an outlier of this, but the US role has also been extraordinarily significant because of the US role in the world. As that diminishes, I think the chance, and I hope the chance for a global kind of sustainable development ethic could take hold, but it's a value change. And the idea of sustainable development as an ethic is the idea of social inclusion as being a core norm for how an economy should function. Or to put it another way, that economic rights are a fundamental part of economic functioning, that everybody has the right to health, education, social protection, and an income that is sufficient to meet household needs with dignity. And that's what the Universal Declaration says, and it's what social democracy aims at. And I think it's achievable, especially given how wealthy we are in the world. So that's what I would liken it to. And another variant that I find extremely attractive and interesting is the Catholic Church's social teachings, which hold similarly, and Pope Francis is a great expositor, of course, and the leader of this view, that a market economy can function, but it must function within the moral boundaries of what the church in its teachings calls the universal destination of goods, which is that the earth is for everybody. So the economy has to meet the needs of everybody. And within that constraint, a market economy provides many benefits, but only constrained by a moral framework.
Good. We have two student questions. Ryan was first and then Enzo.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. So my question was that I do know that you're the co-editor of the World Happiness Report, and I was wondering if you could talk about this, whether there's been some interesting trends in the last few years or anomalous trends as well. Yeah.
Well, the idea of the World Happiness Report is to start philosophically from the idea that our goal is not GDP per capita, but our goal is eudaimonia. It is well-being, and that we now have better tools to actually measure well-being than we thought we had over the centuries. We now can ask people in intelligent ways about their well-being and learn a lot from that. So the World Happiness Report is actually based on one annual survey carried out by Gallup, Gallup International, which asks the so-called Cantril ladder question. And that question is, imagine that your life is like a ladder, that life is a ladder, and the bottom rung of the ladder is the worst life you can imagine, and the top rung of the ladder is the best life you can imagine. And the lowest rung of that ladder is rung 0, and the top rung of the ladder is row 10. Where do you stand on the ladder? That's the question. It's asked to 150,000 people or so around the world each year. We collate the results and then try to account for those results. And the happiest countries, according to that, and happiness is this kind of eudaimonic happiness, meaning your evaluation of your life, not the ha-ha happiness that I really had a good time yesterday, which is also asked, but what we're studying is the eudaimonic happiness. The countries that express the highest eudaimonic or evaluative happiness are the Scandinavian countries. I'm biased. I like that. I didn't construct it that way. I just am happy that it turns out that way because I really like how those countries function by and large. Not perfectly, but by and large. So Finland, the Nordic countries almost invariably come out on the top. The United States has been sinking over time. I don't know what it's going to be. We're going to release this in 2 weeks. I don't even know this year's scores yet. But the United States has been ranking about 20th. And there are 150 countries or so in the rankings each year. Now, what do we learn about those rankings? We learn that income per capita matters, but only to an extent. It matters logarithmically, if I can put it that way, meaning that going from $1,000 to $10,000 income is the same as going from $10,000 to $100,000 income in its effect on rungs per dollar. So you really have a diminishing marginal return of income after a while. Once you're pretty rich, it takes a huge, huge increase on average to generate an extra notch. And the United States has been falling in well-being over the 18 years of this survey. And that's consistent also with a famous prediction and finding of Richard Easterlin at University of Pennsylvania, who christened the Easterlin paradox, where he said that we're getting richer, but we're not getting happier. And the United States has not really had any budge of happiness during the last 60 years. It's had, if anything, a small decline, even though per capita income has risen threefold. All of the data that we have of any kind of data points that overlap over time show no evident sense of lives improving. They show, if anything, more depression, more unhappiness, more stress, more angst in the last 15 years. And the things that we find to be correlated with well-being are income, health, and social connections. So various social measures, social capital, people you can rely on, general trust in other people in the society are strongly correlated with this happiness measure. And I think what we're really learning from it is that to create a happy society, you need a certain level of material well-being. Aristotle said the same, by the way. You need the good fortune of good health, and you need social connection. You need inclusion. The distrust of high inequality, of course, the racism and all the rest is highly destructive of a good society.
Enzo?
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Professor Sachs. My question is about corporations operating in the developing world and how usually they not only exploit those countries where they operate financially, but they leave behind just environmental devastations at the end of the day. So I was just wondering, what types of mechanism can you suggest to the class and myself to deal with this problem, because it's been going on for a really long time. And just a week ago, we were discussing the case of Chevron in Ecuador, and I'm from Nigeria, so I sort of have experiences that are similar to what happened in Ecuador, and that's why I want to get your input on this.
If you want to lead any protests against Shell, count me in. What a disgusting company. What an awful history in Nigeria. And also what an abuse that we're seeing right now that we really should campaign against, which is, and I haven't read the opinion, so I may have the details wrong, but there was a settlement against Shell in the Nigerian Supreme Court, I think 2012. And of course, Shell then took the case to the UK court, And the UK court said, no, you don't have to honor the Nigerian Supreme Court. Well, hell, why not? Who the hell is the UK Supreme Court to decide that, except the former colonial power? And then the Nigerian Supreme Court reconfirmed its finding. And then Shell is now suing Nigeria under the Bilateral Investment Treaty, which is one of the most abusive institutions in the international scene. This is an institution that is part of almost all investment treaties that gives multinational companies extraordinary rights to make claims against host governments that no domestic company could ever claim against its government. So it is a grant of privilege to multinational companies that invites incredible abuse. And this is what the Chevron case was about also, because similarly, the Chevron courts the Ecuador courts had found Chevron guilty, and then Chevron took it to a 3-person tribunal, this ISDS, as well as the New York courts, and overturned the Chevron ruling. And then the tribunal, which is an administrative tribunal, packed with New York lawyers and cronies, found for Chevron, and they're going to find for Shell also. And in the meantime, Shell is, in my opinion, a criminal institution for what it's done in the Niger Delta, because it has destroyed the ecosystem, the well-being, the livelihoods of an enormous population with no accountability at all. And what's my answer to it? This is about power. And, you know, I really think Nigeria should basically kick Shell out of the country at this point. But I would I don't know the details, so I probably shouldn't be quoted exactly that way. But the truth of the matter is that Shell has abused your country historically and needs to pay a significant price for that abuse.
Sorry, go ahead.
So, Enzo, if you want to work on that, send me things that you write, and I'll give you comments.
Sounds good. Good. But even going further than that, it's not just Nigeria that I'm worried about.
No, of course. But let's get Nigeria straightened out on this.
Yes, but my classmates, they're also thinking about the same problems as myself, and we're thinking about ways to solve, some global issues. And one of them, for instance, is tax avoidance and tax evasion by these corporations that function in the developing world. How do we, take on these corporations head on at some point in the future? Not right now, we don't have the means or the capability to do so, but somewhere down the road, how do we confront this problem? And how do we confront problems like, just oil spillage without any sort of oversight from the governments of those countries? How do we deal with problems like that?
I see James Henry on the line, who knows a lot more about how to tax these companies than I do. But I would say, among other things, the design of the taxes really should be changed, because if you put income taxes on, you don't collect anything. It's just so easy to manipulate the system. I do think that Africa is going to need very different and higher royalty rates effectively, or gross revenue collections on oil, on mining resources, and so forth, because actually the African countries and governments desperately need the revenues for development.
Sarah.
My question is about the reforms that you proposed, not only to the political system, but to international institutions in particular. And I was wondering if the reforms that you proposed aren't premised on the idea that they have significant support within the population, which, I mean, if we count the 74 million votes that have been cast for Trump, in spite of everything that he's done over the past 4 years, does not show that the idea of America first is so prevalent within the population that reforms on the scale that you mentioned seem to be quite impossible. You mentioned in the beginning about Asian countries managing the crisis better than Western countries, but isn't it also partly due to the fact that there is this idea of individual rights before social rights, or that the focus is more on the individual rights, and that this idea of global justice and ending poverty everywhere and isn't as prevalent as we'd like it to seem?
Well, absolutely. There are real ideological issues that need to be confronted. My claim is that Americans should support the kinds of changes that I'm talking about, and I would give arguments why, both in terms of ethics and in terms of practical implications. You know, Trump, yes, he represented them, and 500,000 people died, and he lost the election after that. And Biden brought us back into all those UN institutions right away. So I wouldn't give up, but we're a divided country. And the US has been a divided country basically from the start and before the start. And the division has been heavily along racial lines and racial ideology. So there's an ugly side to America and some wonderful side to America as well. And that's the battle. That battle continues. I happen to believe, for a lot of reasons, that we're going to win that battle. But it is definitely different points of view in this country. But I'm not ready to cede this country to Trump or to white supremacists or to stupid, narrow-minded 19th century liberalism or John Locke's philosophy, which, by the way, was a philosophy in the service of taking away Native American land. So I just think that we need to have exactly that kind of debate and understanding, and societies change and they can improve, and that's what we're after. But you're absolutely right. This is not a slam dunk issue. It is, and it is to an important extent, an ideological issue. But I think ideological issues can be addressed, first of all, by historical knowledge, by awareness, by deliberation. And so I think we ought to take up the challenge.
Harrison.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for speaking. I think my question really builds off what you were just touching on there, in that, it strikes me that a lot of the problems we've been talking about find their roots in the Stone Age emotions and nature we have. And I was wondering, and you touched on reforms we can make at sort of the institutional level, but you also touched on the fact that, the best level is always the level closest to the human being. And I was wondering, what sort of reforms do you think we can make to like society or to like education, so that as many reforms as possible are sort of driven by individuals and driven at the grassroots level?
Yeah, I'm part of an effort to promote SDG target 4.7. So each of these 17 sustainable development goals has a number of targets associated with them. And if you look at target 4.7 online, it says that everybody should have education for sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, and a culture of peace and toleration. So this is sometimes phrased as education for sustainable development and global citizenship. And so the idea of this effort, we actually have a project called Mission 4.7 that I'm engaged in with the Vatican and with UNESCO and with Ban Ki-moon to promote this kind of learning. Learn about the world, learn about the environmental challenges, and learn about human decency, and do that in creative ways. So some of that learning is very experiential learning. Some of it is mindfulness learning. Some of it is fact learning. Some of it could be using Zoom in a creative way to connect children all over the world so that they are learning from each other, working with each other in joint projects around the world. I'm trying to talk UNESCO into a kind of global classroom scenario where each week we might visit a World Heritage site with a live camera and a tour guide, and children from all over the world could tune in. So it's not a boring video, but somebody walking along and showing the cool stuff of the Acropolis or Palmyra, Syria, or any one of wonderful sites to give people the idea we're part of this. Oh, that's cool. Mom, you know where I went today? You know, I was in Iraq, in Babylon today, in class. Think of what we could really do with our curriculum if it were engaged. Or another thing I'm trying to think about is, what about if every young person had to go meet with the mayor of their city to talk about how to make sure their city was decarbonizing the energy system? It's something that would be good for the education process. I'm sure that I didn't know where my electricity came from when I was growing up, or how many pounds of carbon dioxide the car was emitting as it was driving along, and so forth. But we should engage, I'd say, younger students as well as all of us, but younger students in problem solving as well, and problem solving in local communities, because every community in the world needs to decarbonize somehow. And every school, each school could ask, children could learn, where does our electricity come from? Could we put up a solar panel on the roof of our school? What is our carbon footprint, and so forth? These kinds of learning activities strike me as something that would have a real tangible effect on understanding and engagement. And I'd like to hear from creative people of the kinds of things that could be done. But I've been enjoying online classrooms like we're having right now. I've been doing it for about a dozen years. Before there was a Zoom, and it was a big production at the beginning, getting everyone online. But you know, I've tried to teach classes with, already a dozen years ago, we had, I called it Global Classroom for Sustainable Development, and we had about 20 campuses online for each lecture. It was pretty cumbersome, didn't work all too well, but I like the idea of it, of everybody being connected, and just the idea that they'd have that they're connected with each other, but nobody could quite hear, and the logistics weren't so great at the beginning. But I do think that we really could experiment with new ways of pedagogy that could engage young people in the problem solving in an exciting way, and give them the sense they're part of a bigger world. And how cool is that?
Radium.
Yeah, alongside Harrison's mention of like Stone Age emotions, and you talked about the factors of well-being, It seems like a lot of those factors, besides finances, rely on good leadership, like feeling a part of something and the communal feeling. So my question for you is, what do you think good leadership looks like? And if anyone comes to mind that we can rightly look to as good leaders?
Well, I would just tell you that Plato asked the same question because the whole Republic is asking that question. How do we get decent leaders to lead our republic? In the end, he created a whole education system for them and a whole elaborate society that would create good guardians. And of course, they would own no property. It was not the Trump family he was looking for. He was looking for something else. But this question of the by causation of virtue in the public, choosing good leaders, and good leaders helping to create a virtuous public is a central theme of Western philosophy, back to Socrates and Plato. And I think it's true. When we have cruddy leaders, it pollutes the whole scene. When we have good leaders, we tend to behave better. And part of our roulette game in the United States is we have a very plebiscitary system where we have this very powerful position, the presidency, and then a creep can come down an escalator and win the presidency and torment the world as a result of that. We escape by a narrow margin. First reform, by the way, I would not have presidents. Or if we had presidents, I would have European style presidents that are good figureheads, but not the powers, because I think the parliamentary system, while it also is vulnerable, as we know, it's not as vulnerable as a presidential system to bringing intemperate, acratic, out of control psychopaths to power. And that's the first role of politics, is to stop people like Trump or Hitler or others from coming to power. That's the first job of politics, is to prevent disaster. And we're not so good at that in this country, and are getting worse, or it's at least very risky. And so the first thing I would do is not have a position like that because it's too dangerous. Of course, you know, in 1787, it looked a lot safer than having a king, and that was the real debate. So instead of a king, we had a president. But if we were writing the Constitution now, I hope we would not design a president. I hope we would go for something much more parliamentary and much more participatory as well. But the question of who leads and how is a question. Who are the moral leaders right now? Who helps to instill good values? I admire, as I mentioned a few times, I admire Pope Francis tremendously. I'm not Roman Catholic, but he's talking for the whole world in a very important, sensible, and ethical way. And by the way, his most recent encyclical is, it's called Fratelli Tutti, all brothers, quoting Saint Francis of Assisi. But the idea of that encyclical is we need to cooperate with each other beyond borders. So it's Neighbors Without Borders is that encyclical. And so he's a moral leader. This country killed a lot of its moral leaders. This is one of the tragedies of the United States. My generation, we had two politicians who had a real tendency towards morality, John and Robert Kennedy, and they were both killed, and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So and many others were killed. So this country, because of its white supremacist traditions, among other things, murdered a lot of our moral leaders. And we don't even recognize what is a moral leader from what is a psychopath very well right now. So we have real work to do to get your question straightened out.
Jim.
I'm going to let Raisa go first, and then I'll.
Oh, do you
Come
want to
back.
let Jonah go? I think he had his hand up like way before me, but I can also go now.
Please go.
But you could go first.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so earlier you mentioned that you helped start the Global Fund to fight malaria, TB, and AIDS, which I thought was like really amazing because Enzo and I actually wrote like a whole paper about this last semester for Professor Pokey's other class. So I was just wondering if you could talk like a little bit about any new initiatives that the Global Fund has been working on or new promising treatments that may be up and coming, and also how the COVID pandemic has hindered like any progress and distribution of necessary treatments.
So all of public health is, all of public health has the features that more money can turn into better health. Because public health is an algorithmic, systems-based approach to population health. And that means that when I proposed a global fund 20 years ago, it was on the basis of good advice that I got from malariologists, HIV specialists, tuberculosis specialists who explained to me how their particular diseases could be controlled in a systematic way. And that means that the Global Fund and its partner institution, Gavi, should be empowered to do more and more. But the Global Fund, unfortunately, has been limited by the donor agencies who control its governance because our governments have not wanted to put more money into the Global Fund. So the Global Fund is finance constrained. It receives a few $1 billion a year. It could easily use 10 times what it has to really build health systems in poor countries. And it would be a phenomenal return in human well-being and in economic development. But it's limited. And the United States has been a big factor in limiting the funding. Strangely enough, when the Global Fund started, it started with the presidency of George W. Bush. And I did not like George W. Bush's presidency almost at all. He started the Iraq War. I thought he was the worst. Little did I know what was about to come, but I was not a fan. But there was George W. Bush Jr. endorsing the Global Fund and getting it started together with Kofi Annan. And that was a wonderful thing because it created a bipartisan feeling about it. It grew and grew and grew because it was successful. And then came the financial crisis in 2008. President Obama was elected. I thought, great, now we're really going to expand. And President Obama's Office of Management and Budget put a ceiling on financing the Global Fund. I couldn't believe it. So it was during the Obama administration that the amount leveled off. And they were told, don't get into new missions, do your job, stick to your lane, don't ask us for more money. What a terrible mistake. And I really resent it to this day that this mistake was made. Then came Trump. You probably have guessed I did not hugely like Mr. Trump. And he tried to cancel help for everything, anything. Trump's idea was anything good must be an enemy of my interests. He's really, he is clinically a psychopath. And so he was out to destroy whatever he could destroy, including attempting to destroy our government by the end. So no new developments took place then. What I'm trying to do right now is find ways to bolster funds to fight COVID, because we need, by reasonable estimate, 30 billion this year minimum for developing countries to be able to fight COVID effectively, and at least another 15 billion more next year. And we've created something good called the ACT Accelerator. And as part of that, COVAX, which is the COVID vaccine initiative, but it doesn't have money in it. And then our governments give little bits of money, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. And what they don't do is what a rational actor would do. A rational actor would say, what is our problem? What is its scale? How much is needed? And where do we get it? That's basic rational problem solving. Our political class does not operate that way typically. Our political class at its best typically says, oh, we should do something. I can find $1 billion for you. Say thank you. And if you say, but $1 billion, that's only 1/10 of what's needed, you're a bad sport. So instead of problem solving, we have checking the box that, oh, of course we're giving for poor countries. We gave $2 billion. But then you're not allowed to ask the question, well, is $2 billion enough, or shouldn't it have been 20 billion? And that's what real problem solving is to ask what is needed to address the problem. So before this call, I was on a call earlier this afternoon about vaccines. And the ACT Accelerator, which is the global multilateral arrangement for vaccines, therapeutics, and PPE for COVID, has a shortfall now of 22.9 billion just for 2021. Unbelievable. Here, the US is about to vote 1.9 trillion for short-term relief. And here's a gap of 22 billion that the whole world can't fill. That doesn't make sense. This 22 billion is roughly 1/100th of what we're about to vote right now. So the US alone could fill it. But the US and the rest of the rich countries could easily fill it. But they don't right now. And if they did, there'd be a storm in Congress, America first, and so forth. So this is the kind of problem that we face in practice. What I'm trying to advocate for right now is to use a new allocation of special drawing rights at the IMF to fill this purpose. And there's a kind of design process underway to see whether we could use SDRs and allocate 40 or 50 billion of a large SDR allocation for the purposes of COVAX. And that could be a way to make a breakthrough, because an SDR allocation does not require each parliament to have a vote. It is a decision of our executive branches of governments, by and large, around the world. And it would be a very good way to mobilize the resources necessary for containing this pandemic, which is the first order of urgency for the whole world, not just for the developing countries, for all of us. We have to contain the pandemic everywhere, for the obvious reason that as long as it is spreading in some places, it is not only at risk of returning anywhere else, but it's at risk of throwing off new variants or new lineages that undermine the existing protections from vaccines or previous infections.
Jim?
Hey, Jeff, it's good to see you again. It's been a long time since Bill Lazanik's econometrics class. 3 years ago, I think we went to Copenhagen and talked about a billionaire's tax.
Yeah.
I've been working a lot on another global tax proposal, which is, I just want to get your read, because it may, the stars have aligned, and I think it may be the solution to some of the revenue problems that we're facing. This is the notion of having a financial transactions tax.
Yep.
And the fact is that, the problem that you described with liberals is kind of well illustrated, because in New York, we have a Democratic controlled assembly and the Senate and a governor. And we also have one of the most successful stock transfer taxes in history. It was passed by a Republican governor in 1905. And for 77 years, it just worked. They raised $100 billion. In the last 30 years, however, since Governor Kerry kind of was stampeded by Wall Street, they rebated $345 billion to Wall Street. So I want to enlist you in this effort to get economists to put pressure on these folks, because in the next 6 weeks, the Assembly and the Senate are going to vote on a concrete bill to simply repeal the rebate, which is now the grand sum of 1 nickel per $100. Because Wall Street last year had record trading, $49 trillion.
Jesus.
And the two exchanges in New York, that would have produced, that nickel tax would have produced $24 billion. The reason that the estimates that the New York State comes up with about the amount of the rebate have been plummeting, even though the volumes have been soaring, is because, as of the commissioner admitted today in testimony that I was participating in, there are some firms that are underreporting. And the state of New York has no direct data on this tax that they're rebating. And this is, Cuomo is doing everything in the book to legalize marijuana, he's cutting the middle class tax cut, $400 million. He wants to tax sports betting. But here we are staring us in the face. There's billions of dollars. And if we pass it in New York, we can move it to the federal level. Jared Epstein supports this, Biden's people seem to support it. They need pushing. And then it goes global, because the EU has indicated they want to do this term. And I think it's just really, the time is right. Every country in the world is in fiscal crisis. So I just wanted to get your reaction to that and see if we can, band together.
Yeah, first of all, count me in for sure. It's extraordinary, the protection that, I think it's extraordinary. Our New York State, every state, and New York City urgently need revenues, and they won't touch the 117 billionaires, and they won't touch Wall Street.
Right.
And what is extraordinary about, and Cuomo is so concerned that no billionaire changes residence, right, that the city with the highest concentration of billionaires in the world has been asked to do precisely zero during this pandemic, as their wealth has soared. Zero. So then on the financial transactions tax, it is, like you say, extraordinary. The tax is actually on the books. It's actually, quote, collected and then immediately rebated. Right. But in other words, the administrative mechanisms, the law is just there. Right. So I would love to get involved.
Great. Terrific.
All right.
A sale.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll do it.
Thank you. We'll do it.
Excellent. Okay.
Jonah.
Hi. So you were talking about how technology seems to be improving so much faster than our policy changes. And it seems to me that because of the incompetence of our governments, that a lot of our problems recently have been solved by technology rather than anything on policy. So for example, like the COVID pandemic being solved by vaccines rather than any effective policy. And so it seems like there's also a big opportunity for these problems to be solved through technology. And I'm wondering, to what extent should we look towards policy to solve these problems? And to what extent should we say, like, screw the policy, let's try to develop better technology to solve the problem?
Jonah, great point and a very perceptive observation. Let me point out to everybody that COVID has been controlled substantially, not completely, but substantially in the Asia Pacific region, while it has raged in the United States and Europe. So there are just basically almost no deaths in China, Taiwan, Korea. And I looked over the last 7 days, we averaged in the US 70,000 cases. China averaged 22 cases, not 22,000, 22 cases per day on average over the last 7 days. Korea averaged 479 cases per day compared to our 70,000. Taiwan, 1 case per day on average. Actually, that's rounding up. It was 0.7 of 1 case per day over the past 7 days. So I guess that's 5 cases over 7 days. In other words, even without the vaccine, this is controllable. What does it require? What these countries have done is contact tracing, quarantining. They have used some technology applications to help to enforce protocols and help to warn. You've been, you've crossed paths with someone that tested positive and that kind of thing. But basically, these countries have relied on public health and have done an excellent job. I noticed this difference. I mean, this difference was apparent from the start, but I started noticing it in mid-March and talking to the politicians here, saying, look, in the Asia Pacific, they're doing it better already. It was impossible to get our politicians focused on that basic fact, especially since they were also keen to say anything China says is a lie. And then if you said Asia, they'd say China. So the level of discourse was primitive, and you could not have a sensible discussion. If you download, which I just recently did, the 100 or so editorials by the Wall Street Journal on COVID, none of them talks about the Asia Pacific success. It's weird. It's like we just don't want to look at what's happening somewhere else. And when the Wall Street Journal does look abroad, it says, well, we're better than Belgium, but not we're worse than Korea. So it's a very odd thing that we have not been able to address this. And you're exactly right that we are jumping to a technological solution, but we can't even make that one work very well because we're not able to get the deployment of the vaccines and the vaccine hesitancy and all the rest of the confusions of a confused society now that make all of this just much harder than it should be. My gut instinct and the structure of the problems that we face tell me that you cannot rely just on technology. Technology without the social and political understanding will not get deployed universally. It will not get deployed even perhaps effectively. Some things technology can't solve that we need human beings to accept. And I'd say most technologies depend on social systems alongside the technologies. and the governance of the technologies depends on normal society with normal moral scruples and boundaries, so that pure technical solutions are very unlikely to work. I'm just thinking, I just finished reading a trilogy of books about the atomic age by Martin Sherwin, who is a phenomenal historian, who wrote a book last year called Gambling with Armageddon about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then he wrote a book before that about J. Robert Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. And then before that, he wrote a book called A World Destroyed, which is about the governance and policy around the development of the atomic bomb during World War II and the implications of that. And the reason I mention it is that nuclear power and the atomic bomb is a technology. And some of our politicians thought it was the magic technology. All we needed was an atomic bomb and we could make the world safe. And it was incredibly naive. And it failed, of course, to make the world safe. It made the world far more dangerous, not safe. And many of the technological assumptions were wrong. People that developed the bomb, not the physicists, but the politicians, and General Groves and others thought, well, the Russians won't have it for 30 years. And of course, the Russians had it within 4 years. And so, and then we ended up in a almost devastating nuclear arms race. So if you don't have the social systems, you can't govern the technologies. And they cannot be magic bullets on their own. And yet, exactly, you put your finger on it, we are looking for the magic bullet rather than the social responsibility and the political responsibility. So we're counting on the vaccine to do it. And it won't do it for some reason unless we get our heads on straight and govern ourselves properly as well. And so I think, you know, the theme you mentioned is, I was thinking about exactly that today, how our quest for the technological fix is so strong and it's so validated by the technologies that it actually goes into a kind of hyperdrive, but it doesn't work. None of these technologies by themselves, without social scruples, decency, norms, provides answers.
Good. I'm afraid we have to end with time, but we are deeply grateful that you came, Jeff, and gave us this enlightening discussion. And we hope that we can call on you again in some future instantiation of this seminar.
Of course, and thank you for having this seminar, because this is the kind of brainstorming that we absolutely need, and get good ideas, papers, themes, reforms out of it, because this is exactly the kind of brainstorming the world needs. So happy to be part of it.
Good. Very good.
Thanks, everybody.
Right.
Thank you.
And call me about the tax.
Will do. Wittgenstein said famously, philosophy is not a set of principles, but an activity.
Right.
This is a good example of that.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.